My partner Andrew and I, we chose the historical concept of contestability because we thought that is probably one of the tougher concepts to nut out, as well as it can be often confused with other concepts like perspective, and it's something that requires a bit more of a critical look, and tends towards historiography. So we thought that might be a nice concept to get into that had a lot of work that we could do with it. We liked that it would establish some higher order thinking skills, and so to complement that, the tool that we used was called MyHistro, which is a tool that combines an interactive map as well as an interactive timeline. And so it's a platform where students can create their own timeline of a historical event or a historical era, and the timeline is superimposed upon the map, and each of those work simultaneous to one another. The reason we picked that, because a map in of itself is not necessarily conducive with a concept like contestability, was in every event, when students create a piece of information, there's an option for their peers to comment underneath with an argument that may be counter to that, and then counter arguments can ensue. And so every isolated event then has a thread of arguments and counter arguments, and we thought that would bring out contestability and contextualize it within events. So often we thought contestability is an abstract concept, but to contextualize it within a map and a timeline frame, and it's really clear and set out for students at each point, and then the threads of conversation, those threads of arguments and counter arguments are visible for everyone. We thought that worked really well. Within that platform, the MyHistro platform, it's quite visible in that subsequent homework tasks were creating content and then going and reflecting on peers' content, and then the final task would be to reflect on your peers' reflection. So this idea of creating knowledge and then providing arguments and counter arguments, that was worked within the day-to-day lesson planning. Our assessment task is something that I really liked. What they had to do is that they were given sources, contesting sources, and they had to deconstruct and analyse those sources, and then they had to do the same to a peer's work. And what we did to make student thinking visible is we made annotations upon a source and annotations upon a peer's source part of the assessment criteria. So students were not just assessed on their own work, but they were assessed on how they annotated the sources and how they contested students in their classes' viewpoints, and how they provided arguments against one another. So it wasn't just their own work. They were marked on their own work, but they were also marked on their interactions with contesting viewpoints within their own classroom and across historical sources. I think probably the only challenge that I can think of, apart from that idea of making the concept explicit, would be perhaps the input of the teacher. And if we're trying to encourage higher order thinking, we had to strike that balance between scaffolding and guiding the students and really allowing them to look at the concept themselves and come to their own understanding. So I think it's a challenge that comes with any teaching, but particularly when you're teaching something where you're trying to encourage students to think for themselves, is we had to strike a balance where the teacher was a guide but not didactic, and then in stepping off as a teacher and allowing students to create their own knowledge and content and come to their own understanding, we didn't want to lead them astray. So striking that balance between teacher instruction and facilitation was probably the biggest challenge when you need to have a concept explicit, but also you want to encourage independent thought. I thought it was good that at that point in our degree we were given the freedom to create a whole unit of study ourselves. We were allowed to be both creative and collaborative, and at every stage we were checking with one another on if we had any ideas and things to add to one another's work. I think the fact that it explicitly referenced using digital tools was increasingly relevant for going into classrooms, and that's something that I found on internship and through pracs, is that might be an area that's lacking in some teachers' repertoire, and so for us to have that tool was incredibly powerful. and it was at the forefront of our thinking. So I think that was a real strength of the task. So we received feedback from people we hadn't met before, so within the different degree, and it was something that was quite small, but things we'd overlooked. So things about the simplicity of the task and being explicit when teaching a concept that is going to be so foundational to a unit of work. And we did adapt that into our final submission. It brought to mind some of the work we've done within the MTeach in other units about this idea of cognitive load, and it made us really empathise with how students are really supposed to be thinking of it. So we as teachers wanted to get the most innovative, amazing looking assessment task, and then when another student looked at it, they saw it and they thought, you know, realistically this is going to overload a student cognitively and it might be counterproductive to do it this way. So it made us simplify it, and it made us empathise a little bit more with a student's perspective, having another university student look at it. In giving feedback, your initial instinct, especially as a history teacher, and teachers are meant to be quite confident, you've got a very set way that you like to teach, and it was a nice exercise in empathy and realising that there might be something that is completely unlike how you would want to teach something, but it could still be valid. And so it was interesting keeping that balance of being constructive and critical. So, and not trying to give feedback that would tend somebody else's work more towards your own style of work, but to enhance their own work. And so I think our first draft of feedback showed that we were giving feedback that made it seem more like how my partner and I would run an assessment task, but then as we revised it, we realised we shouldn't be trying to change theirs, we should be trying to enhance theirs. So it was interesting, and it was a good exercise in giving constructive and complementary feedback. Our thinking of how it should be taught changed, I think, as a response to student feedback and our own personal reflection. The idea of the concept being unpacked more at the start was something that changed over the course of the task. So I think initially we were keen to get as many examples and as many sources through the students as possible, but then reflecting upon that, I think we realised that when you're teaching a historical concept, it's important that the students really have a firm idea of what it is, especially one like contestability, but any of the six. They really need to know what it is, especially if it's going to be the foundation for an entire unit of work. So I think what we amended in our unit of work is that we got the students to really have a clear understanding of what contestability meant before moving on. And I think that's important, otherwise you're going to undermine the value of all the subsequent work. Probably the most constructive thing that I took home from the task is that firstly, it's a teacher's duty, I think, to be quite innovative in the way that they frame a task. And I think incorporating a digital tool is a really good way to do that. I think also the idea of allowing students to create content creates an investment on the students' part in their own work and encourages an accountability. So I think something that we thought was quite important was this idea of mutual accountability. So we created whole class tasks where there was one platform and all the students had to contribute, or the assessment task was the students' own work, but they had to engage with one another. And so I think in encouraging a sense of community and collegiality within the classroom, we thought that would be important to heighten engagement and kind of bring out good responses in the students. So that's probably one of the things that I came away thinking was quite important, is that if you give the students something to create, then they're going to be more invested in the work, which is, I think, as a result of the style of this task that we were given. So we had something to create, and so I found that all my colleagues were more invested in the work, and that's what we reflected in our assessment task. I think it did. It was somewhat limited because I wasn't teaching history as my internship subject. However, I think the broader lessons did stick with me. This idea of, you know, students being collegial and creating their own content, as well as creating a nice guided and scaffolded forum for students to engage in historical debating, I think was something that I brought across in my classes, so within reason as well. So I was teaching quite junior classes, so I think that's probably it.